What if everything you've ever been told about the US dollar was never designed for you to understand in the first place? What if that rising grocery bill, that shrinking paycheck, the debt climbing faster than your income weren't just accidents? What if they were consequences? Not of your mistakes, but of a pattern unleashed more than 110 years ago. Tonight, we are pulling apart the shocking pattern behind America's collapsing dollar. It's a pattern that started way back in 1913, and it's a pattern you are feeling every single day. Your rent didn't just rise by coincidence. Your savings didn't weaken because of bad luck, and your paycheck didn't shrink because you worked less. Once you see this pattern, you'll realize the truth. You were put inside a machine you never voted for, a system that was built to work exactly as it does today. But before we dive deep into this, let's do a quick community check-in. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or your country in the comments below. I absolutely love seeing how this community has grown all over the world. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button for the unfiltered truth. The stories the mainstream media will never touch. Because tonight, we're going right back to the beginning. Right to 1913. Right to the spark that lit this entire chain reaction. To truly understand why the dollar feels like it's collapsing, we have to return to the date that shaped everything, December 23rd, 1913. Think about it. Most Americans were getting ready for Christmas. Congress was nearly empty, with most members already home for the holidays. And in that quiet, almost unnoticed vacuum, the Federal Reserve Act was passed into law. Officially, the Federal Reserve was created to stabilize the economy. The promise was that it would stop the violent booms and busts, calm the markets, and protect everyday people from financial chaos. That was the sales pitch. But let's look at the timeline. Let's follow the pattern. After 1913, what actually happened? In 1929, we got the Great Depression, the most devastating economic collapse in modern history. Then, in 1971, President Nixon severed the dollar's final link to gold, ending the gold standard and turning the dollar into a pure fiat currency. The 1980s brought the savings and loan crisis. The year 2000 gave us the dot-com implosion, wiping out trillions in wealth. In 2008, the entire global financial system nearly collapsed due to the housing market crisis, and in 2020, we witnessed a global economic freeze, unlike anything seen before. Does this sound familiar? Each crisis seems to be larger than the last. Each recovery feels more fragile, and every solution implemented by policymakers seems to create even bigger, more complex problems down the road. It's a cycle that just keeps repeating. And here's the part the textbooks and the news do emphasize. Every single one of these crises repeated the exact same steps. First, a collapse hits. Panic spreads. Then, to save the system, emergency liquidity is pumped in, flooding the economy with newly created money. As a result, the dollar weakens, its purchasing power erodes, and the stage is set for the next bubble. The cycle then resets, ready to start all over again. It happens over and over, crisis after crisis, decade after decade. Look at the timeline between these events. From the Great Depression in 1929 to the end of the gold standard in 1971, that's 42 years. From 1971 to the 2008 housing collapse, that's 37 years. And from 2008 to the 2020 global event, it's only 12 years. Do you see the trend? The intervals between major crises are shrinking, the pattern is tightening, the cycle is accelerating. Does this sound like stability to you? Or does it sound like a system spiraling out of control? Every time policymakers claim to fix the system, what they're actually doing is making the underlying mechanism more dependent on artificial support, more addicted to cheap money, and more fragile than before. And here is the modern parallel, the reason this history lesson matters so much to you right now. You are feeling the consequences of this accelerating cycle today. That inflation you see at the grocery store isn't random. The mountains of national and personal debt aren't an accident. The shrinking value of your dollar isn't just economics. It's a paternal, recurring, predictable pattern that has been playing out for over a century. And now, we arrive at the major turning point in our story. Because patterns like this don't just maintain themselves out of thin air. Something powers them, something hidden, something technical, something that almost no one outside the very core of the financial world understands. And in this final section of Part 1, we approach the big twist. So far, we've traced the pattern of recurring crises. We've mapped the timeline. We've followed the path of the weakening dollar. But now, the real mystery begins. Because what truly transformed America's financial history wasn't just the creation of the Federal Reserve Act itself. It was a mechanism, a specific financial tool that was embedded within it. This tool started small, almost as a footnote in the legislation. It was presented as an emergency valve, something that was only meant to be used in the absolute worst-case scenarios to prevent a total collapse. But that little emergency valve changed everything. Over the decades, that tiny, obscure mechanism evolved. It grew, it expanded, it became the hidden engine behind every crisis and every so-called recovery. Today, this single mechanism directly influences inflation, your wages, the cost of housing, the level of debt, the behavior of the stock market, the availability of credit, and the very value of the dollar in your pocket. And yet, almost no one knows it exists, let alone what it's called or how it works. I'm about to name it. I'm about to walk you through exactly how it works, how it multiplies money out of thin air, how it inflates the entire system, and how it is programmed to create crisis after crisis. But before I reveal what it is, I want you to understand this. Once you know this mechanism, the last 110 years of American economic history will suddenly click into place. Everything from the Great Depression to the inflation you're feeling today will make perfect sense. And the name of this mechanism, you won't believe what it's called, or how simple, yet deceptive, it really is. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in part 2. Alright, let's pull back the curtain. The fictional mechanism I've been hinting at, the hidden force supposedly behind the American dollar's decline. It's called shadow liquidity expansion. I know, it sounds technical, maybe even boring. That's the point. It's designed to be forgettable. But in the story we're exploring today, this concept is the secret engine driving every single boom, every bust, every emergency rescue, every wave of inflation, and every chip away at the dollar's strength since 1913. Let me show you exactly how this fictional machine works. Step by step, it always starts with a crisis. Every cycle begins with a collapse. Think about the big ones: the 1929 crash, the stagflation of the 1970s, the 2008 housing implosion, and the market freeze of 2020. Notice a pattern. Each crisis seems bigger than the last, and each collapse happens faster, and every single time the system panics. That's when the so-called emergency facilities come into play. This is where things get interesting. In response to the panic, what we're calling shadow dollars flood the system. Now, these aren't the dollars in your wallet or your bank account. These are institutional dollars, created through complex financial plumbing that most people never see. We're talking about things like overnight lending, repo facilities, central bank swap lines, special emergency conduits, off-balance sheet support, and synthetic liquidity channels. These shadow dollars, in our fictional model, are specifically designed to bypass the consumer economy. They never touch your hands, but they have one primary purpose: to lift asset prices. They're the invisible hand propping up the markets when they start to fall. Now, here's where the magic trick happens, what we'll call the multiplier effect. These shadow dollars don't just enter the system, they multiply. And we're not talking about a simple 2x or 5x multiplication. Let's look at some fictionalized historical examples to illustrate the scale. Imagine a $500 billion support facility is announced. In this framework, that initial injection doesn't just create $500 billion of stability, it can expand to have a $10 trillion effect on the market, or a $100 billion swap line inflates to create $2 trillion in liquidity downstream. A $1 trillion emergency injection could balloon into $25 trillion in what's called risk stabilization. This isn't real stability. It's the illusion of stability, created by a massive hidden expansion of credit and liquidity. This leads us to the core moral hazard of this fictional system. The shadow liquidity works its magic, but where does it go? It inflates the prices of assets. Stocks, bonds, real estate, corporate assets, they all surge in value. But what about wages for the average person? In this model, they stay flat. Let's take a fictional 40-year snapshot to see the disparity. Imagine asset prices experiencing an inflation of over 1,200%. During that same period, real wage growth might only be 20 or 30%. If you feel like you're falling behind while the wealthy get wealthier, you're not just imagining the gap. In this narrative, it's a feature, not a bug, of the machine, but that hidden liquidity can't stay hidden forever. Eventually, it starts to leak. Step 5 is when that shadow liquidity bleeds into the real world. It seeps into the prices of things you and I actually need. Suddenly, your rent jumps. Groceries cost more, the gas for your car, the cost of transportation, everything goes up. Your dollar just doesn't buy what it used to. And the fictional pattern continues, with the consequences of institutional bailouts landing squarely on the shoulders of the consumer. This brings us to the scariest part of the cycle. The system becomes dependent. It becomes an addict. Each new crisis requires a bigger dose to get the same effect. The interventions have to be faster, the liquidity deeper, the leverage higher. In 1929, the response might have been measured in billions. By 2008, it was trillions. In 2020, multiple trillions. So, what about the next crisis? Following this fictional pattern, stabilization efforts could easily exceed $20 trillion. At this point, the system is no longer stable. It's just dependent on ever-increasing emergency measures to simply stay afloat. And what is the final, predictable consequence of this entire process? The dollar slowly weakens. This is the grand finale of our fictional story. The dollar doesn't collapse overnight in a dramatic crash. It erodes. It's a slow, gradual, predictable decline. A symbolic fictional figure often cited as a 96% decline in the dollar's purchasing power since 1913. This is the pattern, this is the cycle, this is the fictional backbone of the story of America's weakening dollar. If this narrative pattern holds true, then the next crisis won't look like 2008 or 2020. It will be faster, larger, and more global in scale. Why? Because the very mechanism designed to save the system is also the one that weakens it from within. Every emergency response requires more shadow liquidity. Every injection inflates assets further, widening the gap between the rich and everyone else. Every wave of inflation hits consumers harder, and every single cycle leaves the dollar a little bit weaker than it was before. And so, the fictional world of this narrative teaches us a powerful lesson. When a system can only survive by lurching from one emergency to the next, it's already running out of time. Denial is easy. It's comforting to believe everything is fine. Understanding this complex story is hard, but the cost of denial, it shows up in your bank account. It shows up every time you go to the store and spend a dollar that buys just a little less than it did the day before. So here's the final question I'll leave you with. Are we, as a society, getting wiser? Or are we just walking down the same old path, wearing better suits this time around? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. If this video opened your eyes to a new way of thinking about these things, share it with someone who needs to see it. And make sure to subscribe for more breakdowns of the stories the mainstream media won't touch, because once you see the pattern, you can never unsee it. Thanks for watching.